Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. Today, I am delighted to talk to Sheikh Hamza Karamali. You are most welcome, sir.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, Hamza works in the field of science, atheism, and Islam, and he aims to train 10,000 Muslim teachers on how to counter science-based arguments against God. He is also producing a YouTube series called The Thinking Muslim's Guide to Atheist Arguments. You can see all his work through the Basira education, which I will link to in the description below. That's www.basiraeducation.org. And it's really worth looking at, actually. There's some amazing and very accessible resources that you can watch and listen to there. Hamza will be speaking today about Islam's argument for God's existence. I mean, I didn't know there was the argument for God's existence from Islam, so this is an education for me. And I've heard you say, Hamza, that a child can understand the argument for the existence of God. And I find that very interesting. So let's start off with that. Imagine I'm a child. Prove to me that God exists.
Sure. So we look at the sky. The sky is blue. And so I say, who made the sky blue? I look at the leaf of a tree, see it's green. What made the leaf of the tree green? Why does the sun shine? Why does the wind blow? God did it. There you go.
Okay, but a child doesn't understand that we have scientific explanations for all these things.
Good. So I'm going to maybe this will require a little bit of intellectual humility. So we have two options. One option is to say that the child is not as advanced in his understanding as we are, because he hasn't studied science, doesn't know about the laws of nature, doesn't know about nuclear fusion, doesn't know about photosynthesis, doesn't know about how light works. And so he's giving these really simplistic answers and he doesn't really understand what's going on in the universe. That's one option. The other option is maybe he understands something because as a child, he hasn't been exposed to certain ideas that have confused us. So that it seems a little bit, it seems a little bit unlikely when you look at it at first glance, but I'd like us right from the outset just to have these two options before us. So we're going to say that we're going to be a little bit humble, that, maybe the child gets something that we don't. They're there. Now let's come back and answer your question. Then we'll come back to these two options. So I'll give you a scenario. Let's say that there's a long line of people and the person at the front, he is leaning back because, he can't support himself. And then the person behind him, he strikes the person behind him and that person gets hit by him and he can't hold him up. So he starts to fall over as well. And then he strikes the next person who strikes the next person and they're all leaning backward. And this line continues as far as the eye can see. So it goes past the horizon and you can't see what's at the end of the line, but you can see that they're not on the ground. They're leaning on each other and they haven't fallen to the ground. So they're closely packed. So what would you conclude?
Well, what would I conclude? That's a very interesting question. I conclude that we have an infinite series of people leaning against each other, just going on and on and on forever and ever and ever. And that's a curious thing to claim. There's something not quite right there, is there, if there's an infinite series?
Yeah. So I don't think you would conclude that. Well, you might conclude, I think that it might come to you as a possibility, but I think most people would conclude that at the end of the line, there's someone that's holding everything up. Maybe there's a mountain, maybe there's a really strong person or something, maybe there's an alien, whatever, but there's something at the end that's not leaning on anything, that's holding everything up. Because if that thing wasn't there, then they would all be lying on the ground. Let me unpack that. You mentioned infinity. So there's a principle. The principle is that an infinite regress of dependencies is impossible. An infinite regress of dependencies is impossible. So there's many different kinds of infinite regress. So you could have an infinite temporal regress, which means that that comes about in the Kalam cosmological argument. You could have an infinite quantity of space. That's where Hilbert's Hotel and all these other things come from. We're not talking about any one of these things. We're talking about a specific kind of infinite regress. So you have infinite regress or progress. Progress is movement in the forward direction. Regress is movement in the backward direction. So we have an infinite regress, a movement in the backwards direction of a dependency. So we're talking about a very specific kind of infinity. And what we mean by infinity is never ending. So a simple way to say this is a never ending series in the backward direction of thing A dependent on thing B, dependent on thing C, dependent on thing D, on and on and on and on and on. So this is, you cannot have that. And the reason why you can't have that is because if that were the case, then in the case of the line, everybody would be lying on the floor because there's nothing real for anything to depend on. So I leaned back, I'm dependent. I need somebody to support me. So I leaned on the person behind me and he couldn't support me. So he leaned back on the person behind him. Now, if I just take a snapshot, I'm A, the person behind me is B. I'm dependent. I need something to hold me up. So I lean back on B, and B is also dependent. That means he's not doing anything. That means that both I and B are dependent on C. So the presence of B hasn't improved the situation. It's made the situation worse. Right. And then when you add C, that hasn't improved the situation. It's made it even worse. So a never-ending series of dependencies is equivalent to saying that I am not being supported by anything. But obviously I am, because I'm not on the floor. So what that means is that it's not never ending, but everything is being held up by something that doesn't need something else. And the same thing with the things in the universe. So when I look at the sun, for example, why does the sun shine? I'll go in my science class and I'll learn about nuclear fusion. I'll learn that two hydrogen atoms, they come together through the force of gravity to form a helium atom. There's a loss of mass. That loss of mass is released as energy, E equals mc squared, and it continues. And that's the shining of the sun. It's that release of energy, that release of heat. So that's a scientific explanation. But what I've done with the scientific explanation is I have explained one dependent thing, which is the shining of the sun. The shining of the sun is dependent because I look at the sun, I say, what made it shine? I search for an explanation. The reason why I search for an explanation is because I see that it needs something. It's dependent. It's not that shining is not intrinsic to it, but something else is making it shine. But then I point to something else, and that other thing that I point to is a particular property of atoms and a particular way in which they come together. And this is dependent on a variety of things, among them certain constants in the universe that determine the strength of the forces and many other things. But these two are also dependent. They need something else to make them the way that they are. And what the scientist will do is he will search for another explanation, and it's all within the universe. And the things in the universe are all dependent. We have a technical name for it, we call it contingency. The things in the universe are contingent. They're dependent. It means they need something to make them the way that they are. So a scientist is forever searching for another, and that's the progress of science. So the scientist searches, and then it opens up a new vista. And so he searches more, a new vista, he searches more. And the realm of scientific inquiry is the contingent universe. But if we step back for a moment and consider the analogy of that line, then we can see that the things in the universe are dependent on someone who is not dependent on anything. And that has to be something that's beyond the universe, because the universe is entirely contingent. And that being, necessary being who doesn't need anything to make him the way that he is, to make it the way that it is, that's the existence of that thing is what the child discerned. So when the child says that the sky was made blue by God and this was made, the leaf was made green by God, he was making a correct statement. He realized something. But what happens is that when we study science, then we are engaged in explaining things in the universe with respect to other things in the universe, physical things that we can touch, that we can smell, that we can, very easy to access. And we fall into a fallacy. I call it the fallacy of materialism, which is the idea that the physical universe, material universe, is self-explanatory, because that's all we're doing. And so the child, since he hasn't been exposed to that method of thinking, his or her reasoning is a lot more intuitive, natural. So he got it. They got it right.
Okay, I'm nearly there, because the argument is that this is proof for God's existence. You talk about contingency, you talk about cause and effect, things depending on other things, and that's what science observes. I get that. But you say there must be a necessary being, because we can't have an infinite regress of cause and effects. We've got to be, something has to start the thing off, be the initial uncaused cause, the necessary being. But why must the necessary being be God? It seemed that the God of Islam is not just an abstract concept. God is someone who is the most merciful, the loving, the kind, the person who cares about his creation. And that seems to be quite a bit more than just saying that we have to have a necessary being for the universe to exist, a universe of contingent effects that, that don't explain their own origin. I get that, but it doesn't seem to lead to an Islamic conception of God in its fullness. It may point in that direction, but it's not an argument for God's existence in the Islamic sense. Would that be?
So there's two aspects to your question. There's the first part of it. The first part of it, if we just is before we come to the second part, which is the main part, which is what's Islamic about it. Yeah. The way that you articulated when you said that something needs to start it off, and there's a chain of causes and effects, that's not quite what it is. Okay. Right? So this is not a first cause argument. So if you imagine a line of dominoes and they're all lined up, and then you push the first one and that hits the next one and they all fall in the forward direction, that's the first cause argument. Right. You need something to start it off. And in the first cause argument, there's something that's activating something else, which then activates something else, which then activates something else. In the argument that I presented, it's not, the dominoes aren't falling in the forward direction. They are leaning back in the backwards direction. And so there is the difference between them is that when they're leaning back, then then they don't have any independence at all. They're radically contingent. They're radically dependent on someone. Whereas if you do something, there's something doing else.
That's helpful. Yeah, carry on. Yeah.
Okay. So that's the first thing. Okay. So the second thing is that what's Islamic about this argument? Yeah. So there's a number of ways we can come at this. So the first way in which it's Islamic is that it's actually this aspect. So it's not a complete description of who God is. There's other aspects, but this way of thinking and this aspect of God's existence and this way of reasoning about God is there in the Quran. So this isn't an argument that I just made up, right? So, for example, there's a chapter of the Quran that every Muslim child learns. One of the first surahs he learns in Surah Al-Ikhlas. It says, Allahu Samad. Allahu Samad means Allah is the one on whom everything depends, and he doesn't depend on anyone. Was that Abdul Halim's translation that I saw you pick up?
No, yes, Abdul Halim's. Yes, I was thinking.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. Oh, yeah. I'm curious to see how he translates that verse.
Yeah, actually, it's Muhammad Asad's translation, which I think really brings out many of these words. So this is Surah 112. Say he is God the One, God the Eternal, and there's a note, Samad. Other commonly held interpretations include self-sufficient and sought by all. Brackets,
exactly.
The great theologian. And he begot no one, nor was he begotten, and no one is comparable to him. But Muhammad Asad, which I don't have to hand, also has quite an expansive definition in his translation too. Yeah.
But when he said self-sufficient and besought by all, that's exactly it, meaning that not dependent on anyone, but everyone's depending on him. Then, you know, the first verse of the Quran and of every single surah except one, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, the letter Ba there is normally translated as in the name of God, but I think a more accurate in terms of meaning translation would be with the help of the name of God. You're actually seeking the help of God to do something. Why am I seeking the help of God to do something? Because I'm dependent on him. I'm needy on him. I am contingent. That's a way. In the first verse of Surah Al-Fatiha, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise is deserved only by God, the Lord, sustainer of the universe. Why? So when I praise someone, right? So I say, well, that's a nice. You're looking good, right? That was very kind of you. That was so. There's things that I like in the world. I praise people, I admire certain things, and I'm awed by certain. Alhamdulillah, the only one who deserves to be praised is God, because every good thing that we see is something that is brought into existence dependent upon God. So then, Inna Allaha yumsiku samawati wal arda an tazula. Another verse, verily Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps the heavens and the earth in existence lest they disappear. This is like an explicit, the whole. And then there's verses about the signs in the heavens and the earth and the alternation of the night and the day. So these let me just take another one, like another verse. So there's a verse that I remember as a 15-year-old. I recited this verse after my GCSE physics class, in which I learned Bernoulli's principle of flight. And there's a verse that says that don't they look at the birds in the sky that have their wings outstretched, and then they put them in like this, high-flying birds like eagles. مَا يُمْسِكُهُنَّ إِلَّا الرَّحْمَنِ. Nobody holds them in place up there except the All-Merciful. And I said that, well, what about Bernoulli's principle of flight? That's the thing that's doing it.
Where does that leave? I mean, where does that statement in the Quran leave science? Where does that leave science?
Yeah. So science becomes something different. It becomes a different activity. And this is actually a lot of what my work is when you mentioned about training 10,000 teachers. So a lot of what I do is I help Muslim teachers embrace science and integrate it into a contingency perspective. So when you look at science, it from a perspective of contingency, it becomes relations between contingent things. And this goes back to God's mercy, God's wisdom. So the classic example is that when I take medicine, God creates the medicine, God creates the cure. But there's a regularity there. God regularly creates the cure when I take the medicine, but both things are dependent. And he's placed within me an ability to perceive and see these relations in the universe. And that's what I see. Because if I didn't see this, then I wouldn't be able to function. So imagine that you woke up in the morning and you didn't perceive any relations. Just imagine for a second what the world would look like. I gave this as homework to.
I can't even begin to do that exercise. It's too radical for my to understand the question, let alone think of the answer. But
yeah. You're getting it, because my various students, they give very different answers, but one of my students, her name was Zainab, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve her and give her every tawfiq. She's in university now. She said I'd be a vegetable. I wouldn't be able to move. I wouldn't be able to do anything, because when I raise my hand, I anticipate, based on my decision to contract certain muscles, that my hand is going to move this way. Get out of bed, walk to bed. When I go into the bathroom and I squeeze a tube of toothpaste, I anticipate that when I squeeze it, the toothpaste is going to come out on the other side. And it's true. All of these relations are true. They're there. I perceive them. And my life would become impossible if I didn't perceive them. But what I perceive is relations. I don't perceive one thing actually independently bringing anything else about. But it's a common mistake. It's a common mistake to make that association. And the reason why we make that association is because of animal instinct. So there's a famous experiment, Ivan Pavlovian conditioning, classical conditioning, of the Russian scientist who had dogs, and he brought them food and he rang a bell. And so when they saw the food, they started salivating, and he did it again.
I still do that today, by the way. When I can smell cooking, I start salivating. So I guess I'm a bit of a Pavlovian dog myself. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, no, you're not a dog, but but that instinct is there within us.
Yeah.
That same instinct is within us. So when they started, so I'll just, for everybody else who's watching, I'll just finish the explanation. But he did that repeatedly, and then one day he came and he rang the bell and he didn't bring the food, and they started salivating. Mm-hmm. So what had happened was they'd become conditioned into believing that the bell brings about the food. But we look at it now, we say, oh, well, stupid dogs, I'm really smart. Like, I can see that it's a human being standing outside doing all of these things. But maybe when we take advantage of all of these relations and we think that this is doing this and this is doing this, maybe it's all being orchestrated by someone else. And we are very similar to those dogs. And what the argument from contingency reveals is, yes, it is.
Okay, I'm going to throw something slightly, The Matrix, the film The Matrix. Are we talking like a Matrix type paradigm here, where we look at the world of causality, we think we're living, we have real agency, but in fact, it's not that it's an illusion, but because it's kind of there, but it doesn't have that solidity and self-sufficiency we think it has. There is actually a program that's bringing this out, and this program, or the programmer, what's he called in the film, The Architect? I forget the name of if it's like a cipher for God, basically. But the whole program is contrived. And we may think in our scientific wisdom that we are analyzing the cause and effects within this program, but in fact, we're missing the point. The point is that it is actually all orchestrated, ordered, made by someone outside of the program, whom we call God. I mean, would that be an analogy you're comfortable with, or is that a bit?
No, it wouldn't be. But that would be an analogy that Sam Harris might be comfortable with, and so what that illustrates is, what I want to illustrate is that this. So you've touched on human agency and free will, right? And that's one of the most common reactions to someone when that someone has, particularly people who don't have experience with being Muslim or a non-Muslim who's looking from the outside. That wait a minute, this means that it's all an illusion. I'm not really doing anything. So the first thing that I think is important to understand is that this idea, it can also be the conclusion of materialism. So if somebody believes that the universe is completely atoms and molecules and laws of nature, and then everything that happens, including what we're doing right now, is a result of the initial conditions at the moment of the Big Bang and the laws of nature that were there, and then the inevitable unfolding of reality. And so this is the matrix, right? So this would be the matrix, because there's what's the program? The program is the laws of nature, and everything is an illusion, and there's no free will, there's no choice. So this illustrates two things. The first thing that it illustrates is that the issue of free will and determinism and human free will, it's not related to God per se, but it's related to there being something more powerful than me on which I depend. So if that thing is God, then it creates the problem. If that thing is laws of nature, it creates the same problem. So it's not something that's unique to God. Now, if we kind of compare these two perspectives, we know that the contingency argument shows that the Sam Harris way of looking at things is a mistake, because there's no necessary being on whom everything depends. But if we just compare the two for a second, and we add one thing to God. So this now comes back to something else that you asked. I think I'll just quickly go there and come back to your question, which was that God has, he has there's other aspects to God other than his necessary existence. And one of these aspects is his agency. So God is in the Quran and also through reason, he's a volitional agent, meaning that he knows, he chooses, and he's not a machine. He's not a machine. So, and someone who has agency can choose to do something and choose not to do something. This is why we pray. This is why I supplicate to God. I ask him to fulfill my needs, because everything is dependent on him, and he can make things in any way. And so now, just like if we just have a quick comparison, the Sam Harris view is a machine. That's the matrix, right? Over here, it's not a machine. It's not a machine. It's God who's most merciful, and so that's a difference. We can explore this difference a little bit, but I think that brings us to. So tell me how you want the conversation to go. So from here, so
I just want to ensure I'm understanding, just to summarize in my own words. You seem to be saying that the universe is not self-sufficient, that it's radically contingent for its very existence, the existence of anything and everything in it, to a being beyond it that is not the universe, not within the universe, obviously, but beyond the universe in some way. Not before in time, as if you could have it before, like a first cause. You don't mean that at all. You mean that in the ongoing existence of the universe now, every second and every event and every cause in the universe, it's radically dependent on, for its existence at all, not just cause and effect, but its very existence,
yes,
necessitates the existence of a necessary being which you call God. And because the universe exists in the way as such, it's clearly must be the creation of a will, because it's contingent. It doesn't have to be here, because everything in the universe might not exist. Therefore, there is a will, expression of will in some way, which suggests consciousness, purposefulness. So we're filling out a conception of God here, which is not just a machine, It's God with will and volition, as you say. Um, is everything I've said in my own words there now on track with what you're saying? Or am I still not quite on beam with your?
Yeah, I would. So just to kind of a little bit expand. So yeah, our what it shows is our relation to God is a relation of dependency. It's not a temporal relation. It's not a spatial relation. It's a dependency relation of our. So that's the first part when you were saying beyond the universe.
Yeah, we're doing, to use jargon here, but this is ontology here, isn't it? We're dealing with the origin of being, the being of God, the being of the universe is radically contingent on the being of God. So why is there something, right? This is Wittgenstein's question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something? Why is there anything? And that is because God has brought it into being. Are you with me?
Yeah. So I think we would modify what Wittgenstein says by saying, why is there something? Why? So I don't agree with that dichotomy, right? So I don't, and that's not. And there's a lot of so William Lane Craig uses this in his Kalam cosmological argument, and when he does, it's not. I don't think it's sound reasoning. It's not what the scholars of Kalam would say. So we're not saying why there's something rather than nothing, because then that applies also to God. Like God, why is there something rather than nothing with respect to God? So that's not what we're saying is, why is there something contingent? That's what we're saying. And this something nothing dichotomy, it leads to a number of problems down the line. Maybe we can, but so we should kind of come back to what you said. So the first part is good. Second part is, I really like the way that you said that contingency brings out volition, will, because things could have been some other way. And that's something that we perceive. We perceive that something could have been some other way. I wouldn't say consciousness, because consciousness has a little bit of an anthropomorphic nature to it. But I would say, and the Quran says, life, knowledge, will, and power. And God created the universe through his power and his agency. He chose to make it. He freely chose to make everything the way that it is.
Mm-hmm. But
where shall we go?
Sorry, it's not just that God upholds the universe in existence in this way, or the contingent universe, but that everything within it also is dependent on God's creative power for it to exist in this dependent way. Okay, so coming back to the child's, you asked me, this is the beginning. I asked you to imagine a child. The child says something on lines of the sky is blue, who made the wind, and so on. Well, God did. So you're saying in the most fundamental way, or the most absolute way conceivable, that is true. And that science, or particularly some expressions of science, are very materialist in their analysis and focus on particular, within the universe, relationships between, say, cause and effect.
Yeah.
And we kind of think, well, that's everything, the explanation of everything. And you're saying, no, there's a much bigger context of contingency leading to, yeah. So I think I understand. So the child's answer was, at a fundamental level, the correct answer, but this doesn't leave science with no room. It still leaves science with its own little area of activity, looking at the observable within the universe. But if it thinks that is the totality of all that there is, and it can explain everything, then it's violated that more fundamental understanding that you've outlined. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah. So science becomes a description of regular contingent relations in the universe.
Yeah.
And so what that means is you can have science. You do it, and science is true. And it is telling us real things about the world. And, E equals mc squared is true. F equals ma is true. Photosynthesis is true. Everything that a child would learn in science classroom is true. But we're adding, just to use jargon again, we're adding metaphysical clarity. So the science is at the level of relationships between the observable things, but we're saying that there's something in the background, so to speak. And when you see the thing in the background, then the foreground, it comes to have a different meaning. And so what's the different meaning that it comes to have? It now, this also goes back to what you said, what's Islamic about this? This is what allows me to have a spiritual relationship with God in everything that I do.
Right.
So when in La ilaha illallah, like the quintessential statement of Islam, there's no ilah except Allah. The word ilah, sometimes translated as God, in the ancient Arabic language, it means something that is worshipped. And so when you worship something, one of the most beautiful expressions of that is the prostration. So you prostrate and you are supplicating, and that expression is an expression of my own neediness to God, who doesn't need anything, who fulfills all of my needs. That only belongs to Allah. La ilaha illallah. There's no one to whom this is expressed except God, because He is the one on whom I depend on. And there's some beautiful verses in the Quran. Sayyidina Ibrahim, the Prophet Abraham, he said that He's the one who feeds me. He's the one who gives me to drink. And when I get sick, He's the one who cures me. He gives me life. He gives me death. And this is called Tawheed. And that Tawheed is what's so I think monotheism doesn't quite capture it. But this is the essence of what every prophet came with, and that's what that child grasped.
But what I like about your presentation, your argument for God's existence, is that it neatly bypasses, it seems to me, all these arguments about evolution and the Western understanding of intelligent design connected with certain, advocates like Stephen Mayer in the United States, who, by the way, is going to be a guest on Blogging Theology in a couple of weeks. No, I admire a lot of his stuff, but your perspective completely bypasses any of these issues as a problem for anyone. I mean, they just are irrelevant because you're taking, as you say, a step back behind this and beyond it, and you're not hitching your argument on this alleged irreducibly complex mechanism we see in a bacterium or something, like some people have done. Yours is more metaphysical, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. So the thing with intelligent design is, I love reading those books, because one of the things, but I'll tell the but in a second, but I like to say the good things about it. Yes. That science has revealed these relationships between things in the universe that we never knew, and so what this does is it shows that the universe is not just. It's not just the matrix. It's not a machine. There is some kind of an agency behind it all. So, that's what these arguments do. What these arguments do is a materialist scientist. There's two things that there's. You can say there's two. He makes two mistakes. The first mistake is that he says. He ascribes he says that the universe is sufficient to explain itself. And that's corrected through the argument from contingency. The other mistake, and it's a lesser mistake, but as a result of that, when he says the universe is self-sufficient, modern science is it's mechanistic. So it describes the universe as though it was a machine. And a machine isn't something that's alive. It doesn't have knowledge, doesn't have will, doesn't have power. And when you see all of these examples of design, you say it can't be a machine. It can't be a machine. And that's true. But that doesn't take you to God. Because to get to God, you have to show if God is the one on whom everything depends and who himself does not depend on anything, that doesn't take you there. All this shows you is that the mechanistic way of looking at there's something else at work. And so what it does, it kind of shakes the materialist worldview of the scientist. Then you have to take them a little bit further. And then when you take them to the radical contingency dependency upon God, what that does is, and it's really interesting because it allows the scientist to have his science as well, Whereas, but if you just take the irreducible complexity route and you don't bring that thing, then it turns into a battle between science and God, because you have to show that science cannot explain this thing. You have to create this opening, and then you say, okay, that means that God is doing this thing. But what about everything else? So what about, so the contingency, the argument from contingency shows that the universe is evidence for the existence of God, even without design.
Yes, I take your point. And I think the Surah 112, an incredibly brief surah, just a couple of verses, in a very concentrated way, makes that point as well. But it also, it's not just, is it? I've heard you say elsewhere, it's not just the Western intelligent design movement. It's not, but it's also other forms of the contingency argument which you think are not really up to scratch. For example, in Christianity, I mean, we mentioned William Lane Craig, of course, who was a Christian philosopher, still very active today online. And but you think that there's a problem with the Christian understanding of the contingency argument as well, don't you?
Yeah. So William Lane Craig is he does make the argument from contingency. He's more known for the Kalam cosmological argument, which isn't the argument from contingency on the face of it. But I think someone like Thomas Aquinas would be a better example of someone who famously made the argument from contingency. So the argument from contingency, I think, has been around for a long time. And it's been around from the perspective of Muslims. It's been around since the time of the first man, because it's something, it's part of Tawheed, which every messenger came with. And so the Prophet Adam, he would have taught it to his children. And so it's there. And so then when we see it, if we see an aspect of it in ancient Greek philosophy, or we see an aspect of it in a Christian argument, or we see an aspect of it here, an aspect of it there, then the way that Imam al-Ghazali, he famously said that these are the way that someone like him viewed the ancient Greeks was that they had remnants of prophetic wisdom, things that they taught. So there's something before them. It's not like the Enlightenment narrative that the Greeks are they're the ones who the origin of mankind. There's a prophetic history, and so but it gets corrupted. It goes wrong, and so you'll see a little bit of it here, you'll see a little bit of it there, but it won't be there in its pure form. So in Christianity, it can't be there in its pure form, because if someone believes in the incarnation and the crucifixion, then they are saying that God became a contingent thing, and you're ascribing all kinds of contingent aspects to God. So that's why, even though someone like Thomas Aquinas would make the argument from contingency, he would still ascribe some kind of a necessity, some kind of an independence to nature, and that's why he would make the first cause argument as well. And that reveals that. So that's interesting. I mean, Christians do say that Jesus is God, and that seems to bring God within, as you say, make God contingent and indeed mortal. It gets worse than just contingency. God dies in much Christian theology, although there's a debate about this. But the immortal dies, and they seem to rejoice in this what they would call a paradox, what other people might call a complete contradiction, of course. Okay, well, perhaps lastly, we could come to criticisms of your view. How would an atheist respond to this argument, the argument that you're proposing, I mean? Okay, so we can put it into a formal form, and that's what the later scholars of the Kalam tradition did. Kalam is traditional Muslim theology. So the argument is present informally in the Quran, in the child, in people, and you can kind of see it. But if he wants to discuss with other people, answer objections, then you have to take it and put it into into a formal, form, deductive form. So it would go something like this. Like, for the first premise would be, the things in the universe are contingent. Everything in the universe is contingent. The second premise would be everything that is contingent or exists contingently needs a necessary being to make it exist. And then the conclusion would be, the universe needs a necessary being to make it exist. All A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. So now, if you agree with the first premise and you agree with the second premise, you must agree with the conclusion, which means that if you disagree with the conclusion, you must disagree with one of these two premises. So the two premises to disagree with are, the first one, everything in the universe is contingent. So an atheist would either object to this, or he would object to the second, which is that contingent things need a necessary being to make them exist. So the first premise, I think, is not really something that can be, and any kind of objection to it can be sustained, even even by an atheist, because atheists now commit themselves to science. So what does science do? Science searches for the explanations of things. So when I look at anything like the sky, why is it blue? I ask, why is the sky blue? And then I search for an explanation. Now, in order for me to say, why is the sky blue? I can only ask that question if I admit that the sky is contingent, because if it weren't contingent, then it would have to be the way that it is. And so I would say, oh, the sky is blue. Oh, well, that has to be like that. I don't need to do anything. And so the fact that, in the modern world where science is so important, that the mere activity of science, it becomes impossible if you say that things in the universe are not contingent. And so I think this is the most effective way to there's other ways people have done, but this is the most effective way to do it, because you have to give up science. Nobody wants to give up science. So then they'll come around it another way. So they'll say that, well, okay, the individual things in the universe are contingent, but the universe as a whole is not contingent. And they'll say that this argument commits the fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is when you ascribe to the whole a quality based on the existence of that quality in its parts. So what's the classical example of the fallacy of composition? How does it go?
I did read it earlier on. I can't remember what it is now. No, I think it was just a theoretical point about you can't, the numbers in a series form a set, but you can't judge those numbers. I don't know.
There's the example of a wall that's not composition. Mm-hmm. And then there's okay, right. So you take the example of a wall, right? Mm-hmm. So you say that all of the bricks in the wall are small, mm-hmm. and you put them all together and you say, therefore, the wall is small. You've committed the fallacy of composition. Or if you say all of the big bricks in the wall are light, therefore the wall is light, you've committed the fallacy of composition. But you could also say that all of the bricks in the wall are hard, therefore the wall is hard. You haven't committed the fallacy of composition. So when an atheist comes and says that the individual parts in the universe are contingent, but the whole is not, you commit the fallacy of composition. He needs to show that the composition of the universe from contingent parts is a kind of composition that, and the quality of contingency is a kind of quality in the context of that composition that disappears when the things are composed.
But I have to just try. I'm surprised there's even a discussion, because I thought it was reasonably well established that the universe had a point of origin in the Big Bang. We know from multiple kind of factors now, the expanding universe, so we can, go back in time when it was contracting. We know from the cosmic radio background redshift thing, that suggests also, blah, 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 blah. So why is this even an object for discussion? The universe didn't always exist. It started at a particular point in time, so to speak. Therefore, it's contingent. It's not an eternal necessary universe. So
exactly.
But if it was eternal, however, like Aristotle perhaps believed it was, or certainly before the Big Bang came along, the steady state universe, was it in the 1930s, 1920s, that suddenly changed. But before then, it was assumed the universe perhaps had always existed. But that's not really a problem then for you, is it? In your radically contingent perspective on things, God still brings the universe into existence moment by moment, even on that model. Is that not the case? That's not a problem for you, I mean.
It's not a problem philosophically.
Philosophically, yeah.
Right. But in scripture, God created the heavens and the earth.
True.
From nothing.
Yeah, it's a good point. So it would be a problem in that sense. This is true.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you. I just wanted to just express my. I don't understand.
I think that's it. I mean. So I think that challenging the first premise is really. I don't know. I like to be academic, but the word I want to say is silly. It's just not an academic word.
I'm not familiar with that term. I'll look it up later in my ultra academic dictionary, and tell me what that word means.
So, but it's not reasonable, right? And this actually brings us back to the beginning, where our point of departure, which is Imam al-Ghazali famously said that when you entertain a very unreasonable, complexly worded objection, you give the impression that something is a lot more difficult than it really is. So, but then you have to kind of balance, and it's a judgment call, like when you do it, when you don't. But here, definitely it applies. So I think we can stop here with the first one. Maybe we can explore other objections at another time. But then the other objection that the atheist would have would be to the second premise, which is that all contingent things need a necessary being to make them exist. Right. And that objection would return to some kind of an objection to an infinite regressive dependencies being possible. And so I haven't seen any kind of reasonable argument there. But it would have to be like, for this particular argument, that's the only way to object to it. And I think it's pretty easy to see that it's a strong argument.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it intuitively seems correct, your argument, but I'm just fascinated. We won't go into this now because we're coming to the end, really, but I'm fascinated by the notion of infinity, what that is in mathematics and in philosophy, and also this idea of infinite regress as well, and what that might mean, because it's not always very clear what we mean by infinity, not clear to me what we mean by infinity anyway. Is it a thing? Is it just a mental construct? Does it exist in the physical universe? What do mathematicians say about infinity? Because there is a concept, there's a symbol, isn't there? Infinity symbol in mathematics. I was speaking to a mathematician about this. There's two of them. I didn't even realize. Maybe there's an infinite number of
one's a Hebrew letter.
Okay, cool. And he admitted that it was highly debated in mathematics, if there is such a thing, even as infinity. So anyway, well, perhaps we'll leave that there. Unless you want to perhaps give us a few concluding thoughts on Islam's argument for existence. I think that the thing that really strikes me is that this is an argument that's made in the Quran, and it's an argument that traditional Muslim scholars have understood is obligatory to teach and obligatory for every Muslim to know. So in the science of Kalam, they would say that the first obligation of every human being is to know the existence of God and the genuineness of the Prophet ﷺ based on evidence. So, and I find that really, really remarkable, because it's not a philosophical argument made by an apologist who belongs to a faith, but it's really genuinely coming from within the religion. And I think that's
I think that's very.
No, it's great. And it's based on it's there alluded to quite clearly in the Quran, in at least one passage, Surah 112, as you mentioned. So it's an argument the Quran presents. So, well, thank you very much for that, Hamza. I as I said, I will post the link to your the work you do at the Basira Education, and there are lots of YouTube videos. Actually, there are very good quality videos, actually, and they're very clear in their exposition and leading people into the many myriad issues to do with the Thinking Muslim's Guide to Atheist Arguments. So I do recommend that as well. And maybe, God willing, one day you can come back, and there are many other things to discuss to do with atheist arguments and the Muslims' response to that, because it's an ongoing issue very much in the world at the moment. But thank you very much indeed for coming on, and I'm sure viewers will find this extremely interesting. And until next time, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Paul.